Now that we've laid out some of the reasons why we want to pay attention to polity in canons, let's turn now to thinking about the Constitution of the Episcopal Church. And so let's begin with the preamble here. I just want to read that for you. The Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, otherwise known as the Episcopal Church, which name is hereby recognized as also designating the Church, is a constituent member of the Anglican Communion, a fellowship within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, of those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, and regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury, upholding and propagating the historic faith and order as set forth in the Book of Common Prayer. This Constitution, adopted in General Convention in Philadelphia in October 1789, as amended in subsequent General Conventions, sets forth the basic articles for the government of this church and of its overseas missionary jurisdictions. So it's a lot to notice in this preamble. This preamble has been revised several times over the years, and you can go look at the original 1789 preamble in Documents of Witness by Armantrout and Slocum. Note the official name of the church, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. This name is then abbreviated to the Episcopal Church, which happens around the year 2009, I believe, at General Convention. And then a clause about it being a member of the Anglican Communion, which is added in 1967 as the structures of the communion are becoming more formalized. And then defining the communion as an apostolic Catholic fellowship under the See of Canterbury. That section here about both naming it as the Episcopal Church, not just the Protestant Episcopal Church, and about being part of the communion are added later in time. But then goes back to talking about propagating historic faith and order as set forth in the Book of Common Prayer and about this Constitution. And then we're getting back to older structures of the Constitution itself. So this just gives us a sense of what the Episcopal Church thinks is essential about itself, and it's thus worth reflecting on. As we walk through the various articles of this Constitution, let's just reflect on some highlights about them. Article 1 concerns General Convention. This is very appropriate since General Convention is the organizing authority of the Episcopal Church. So Section 1 simply lays out what General Convention is and how it ought to operate. It's a bicameral body for governance. That means there's two houses, a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. And it lays out the essential idea of freedom of debate within both houses. Section 2 concerns the House of Bishops and how it ought to be composed. Note that's composed of bishops, bishop coadjutors, which is a bishop who has been elected to succeed a bishop, but that prior bishop has not yet retired. A suffragan bishop, an assistant bishop, who is a person who has already been ordained bishop and usually has retired and then comes to assist a bishop in a diocese, and resigned bishops. All these can have voice and vote. Now, what's unique about the Episcopal Church from other Anglican bodies is it permits resigned bishops to have vote. This has caused some controversy over the years in the Episcopal Church, and perhaps we could discuss that in class some more. Section 3 outlines the office of presiding bishop, who is to be elected by vote of the House of Bishops and confirmed by the House of Deputies. Now, note that that would be a change that takes effect in the year 1919 when the role of presiding bishop is changed to have a more centralized role over being someone who simply presides over the House of Bishops and retains their diocesan seat. Section 4 concerns the House of Deputies. Here, what's noted is how representation occurs. All dioceses are to be represented, all area missions, so like the Navajo land, the convocation of Episcopal churches in Europe. They are Each of these entities are to be represented by 4 clergy who are canonically resident in the diocese. That means they are part of that diocese officially. 4 lay people who are to be adult communicants in good standing. Adult communicants in good standing is defined later in the canons. There's to be an election process for how to appoint deputies, but the Constitution does not lay that out. Instead, it says that dioceses or convocations ought to determine that. Now, this is an important concept that I want to flag right here, and I have this concept in the lecture notes. It's called the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is a legal concept which says that if another entity can define what a process ought to be in legal or canonical terms, it ought to be left up to that entity. So, if General Convention doesn't need to determine how deputies are elected, but the dioceses are completely competent to be able to do that, then that activity ought to devolve to that other body. This is then a notion of stacking, so that the canons and the Constitution are only concerned with the things that are necessary for the governance of the whole church. If there are things that really appropriately belong to governance within dioceses, then dioceses can handle that. So that's the principle of subsidiarity, and that explains sometimes why some things that you might expect to appear in the canons, like how to elect deputies, doesn't. Moving on to section 5. Here this talks about process for voting and passing legislation at General Convention. So a majority vote of deputies will carry a question. That means that a simple majority would allow a resolution to pass in the House of Deputies. Now, there's something called a vote by orders. And this is when your diocesan deputations are split up so that the 4 clergy in a deputation and the 4 laity vote separately. And this happens in some cases when the canons require it, or if the clergy and lay deputies together of at least 3 dioceses request it. Having just 3 dioceses request a vote by orders is actually a very low bar. When that happens, the vote of clergy and laity from each deputation are tallied separately. And for a vote to carry in any deputation, each order must vote in majority in the affirmative. Now, because you have a 4-4 composition, it's possible to have split deputations, where 2 clergy vote for something and 2 clergy vote against something, or the same with laity. So what that means is tied deputations are actually counted in the negative. And this is actually going to be quite important once we get back to talking about the vote for women's ordination in the early 70s. Section 7 of this article lays out that General Convention must meet at least once every 3 years, and it may meet as a special convention when required to do so by the House of Bishops. I want to move on to look at Article 4. We are going to focus our attention on certain sections here. Everything, of course, is worth knowing about. Article 4 touches on standing committees. So each diocese must have a standing committee elected by a diocesan convention. And a standing committee in a diocese serves as a council of advice to the bishop of the diocese. Importantly, when there is no bishop in a diocese, which is the case recently in the Diocese of Nevada and happens in other places from time to time, the standing committee serves as the ecclesiastical authority of the diocese. So the standing committee, for instance, would approve ordinations or approve people for the ordination process, and then would have a bishop from their diocese come in and perform the ordinations. Or the standing committee would approve things around parish processes, hiring processes, etc. Article 8 is about requirements for ordination, And it's just always useful for us to review this sort of thing. A lot of you probably have had to read this if you have gone into the ordination process. And I just want to highlight what's really important here is that the declaration that you need to make, which is in bold here. I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be the Word of God and to contain all things necessary to salvation. And I do solemnly engage to conform to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. So in the ordination service, you need to read this out loud, and then you will be given a form to sign that says you do swear to uphold this. So this promise is at the core of what a priest promises to do. And it's worth meditating on this and to ask yourself, what does it mean to believe these things? And what does it mean to swear conformity to these things? And perhaps we can also discuss that in class. Let's look at Article 10 of the Book of Common Prayer. Note some of the requirements that are also laid out here. The Book of Common Prayer is to be used by all dioceses. To alter or to make additions to the Book of Common Prayer requires a proposal and one regular meeting of General Convention, and then notification is sent to all dioceses about a revised prayer book. There's a 3-year period of study, and then the revision is voted on again at the following General Convention. And the resolutions to revise the prayer book must pass as majority in the House of Bishops and by majority in both orders of clergy and laity in the House of Deputies. However, if there are more minor changes to make to a prayer book, there can be a vote by majority in each house to simply amend things, particularly lessons and psalms. Because sometimes we revise the lectionary or might have a new psalm translation, that is seen as a lesser burden than revising the rubrically appointed services. Also, what can be passed by simple majority is authorization for trial use of alternate liturgies, like the enriching of worship materials or the revised marriage rites, or alterations to a section or office of the prayer book, or to authorize a proposal to revise the Book of Common Prayer, not to approve the revised prayer book, but to approve a proposal. Now, we are actually in the middle of a kind of uncertain process around this. From the 2018 General Convention, there is a movement to begin to think about prayer book revision, but there's not a formal prayer book revision proposal that's existing yet. And also with that, I hope we can perhaps talk about that during our class session. That's all I want to focus on for the Constitution. Again, there are other important elements in the Constitution, and do review those also, but I think these are the most prominent aspects of it for us to pay attention to. So for the next video, we're going to be looking at Title I, Organization and Administration, and Title II, which is on the worship of the church. And I will see you then.